growing things organically, it really is a challenge in terms of pest control. There are some insects that we have either good systems worked out for controlling them without pesticides, or some good pesticides that are organically approved that will do a good job. But one of the most interesting things I've done since I've been at Purdue was actually the very first farmer visit that I had to do back in 1988. And this was a conventional vegetable grower up in the northwest part of the state who was having problems with his cabbage. And so when I went to visit him, his cabbage crop was just starting to make heads, so that heads were very small, and it was just being devastated by an insect, a caterpillar called the diamondback moth. And this is a small caterpillar. It occurs in very large numbers. It's a worldwide pest of crucifers, and he had a real serious problem. I collected about 200 caterpillars from a single plant, and there were plenty more left. I just got tired of catching them, and so he had a real problem. And what he had done was he bought his transplants from Georgia. And when he brought the transplants up, they were already infested with diamondback moths. And not only were the diamondback moth larvae there, but they were resistant to a lot of pesticides because they had been sprayed so heavily when they were producing them down in Georgia. So he planted his cabbage, but he also planted his problem. Okay, so what he did then was, when he saw the insects, he sprayed with the pesticide that he would normally have sprayed with, not knowing that the insects that were there were already resistant to that pesticide. And so it didn't work. It didn't kill the diamondback moth larvae at all. But what it did do was it killed the natural enemies that helped to keep the diamondback moth under control. And later on, we did research that showed that about 65% of the diamondback moth larvae will be killed by a very tiny little wasp parasite if you don't do anything to mess up the system. And so what I recommended that he do then was to change from a synthetic insecticide to an organic pesticide, a BT product, or Bacillus thuringiensis. And he did, and that was a very effective material. It worked really well. It allowed the natural enemies to come back because it was not toxic to natural enemies, and he was actually able to market that crop of cabbage, which I was surprised that he was able to do because the damage was so bad when I visited his farm.
If people ask me what's the most important thing you can do to encourage beneficials in your garden, I tell them plant flowers. That gives them a food resource. I tell them to be careful how and when you spray, because a lot of beneficial insects are active during the day but aren't at night. So if you have the need to use an insecticide, let's say, then make sure you spray at night so you would avoid the presence of the beneficials. Gives the insecticide a little chance to dry up, and then if they come in the field the next day, they're unlikely to be impacted as directly as if you sprayed them. So I tell them to plant flowers and spray at night, and basically know who's the good guy.
Pest control is very difficult in organic farming, and one thing that I always tell organic farmers not to do is to try to think that they're going to farm just like a conventional farmer and substitute organic pesticides instead of conventional pesticides into that system. It really has to be a systems approach where a lot of the effort goes into preventing pest problems rather than trying to cure them. So for example, you want to do everything you can to encourage natural enemies. So if you have a large population of natural enemies, it will keep your pest at relatively low levels, and then you don't have as many crises that you have to try to fix with the pesticide.
If you want beneficial insects in any particular habitat, whether it be an agro-ecosystem or a garden ecosystem, you got to provide those insects what I call the life requisites. They need food, they need shelter, and some of them may even need water. So many of them would feed on nectar of plants. So what I like to tell people, if you're trying to encourage beneficial insects, feed them. and then they'll hang around. So plant flowers that produce nectar, and they will be there feeding on the nectar, and then hopefully they will discover that there are some caterpillars that you don't want in the garden, and they will lay their eggs on them, and that's why we consider them beneficial insects. So we can have food resources for them. If they depend on shelter to hide, places to rest, then some vegetation that gives that sort of a shelter thing would be useful as well. And that's the reason we say some windbreaks and things might be useful, because insects are not good if the breeze is blowing really well across that field. Why, then they're not able to move as well, and so they may go somewhere else. When I classify beneficial insects, I like to think of at least three groups. Those insects that are predators and parasites on the insects that we consider pests. Those insects that are pollinators, because an awful lot of plants are insect pollinated and they depend on the insect to transfer the pollen. And the third thing would be insects that are what we call recyclers or decomposers, because they then recycle plant material, get it back into the nutrient cycle, and the world continues to go round.